Every year, floods kill tens of thousands of people and millions more are left homeless, sick, and impoverished. For many, it seems there's just too much water on our planet. But at the same time, around the world, green spaces are turning brown, lakes and rivers are drying up, deserts are creeping, slowly blanketing more and more of the earth. For others, there's barely enough water. My name is Mark de Villiers. Much of my life has been spent exploring the world as a journalist. But during the last few years, I've devoted a lot of time to thinking, learning, and writing about water and what it means to the life, the very existence of our planet. So what we're going to do over the next hour is look at our relationship with this most mysterious and magical of substances, the source of all life on Earth, our greatest friend, and at times our deadliest adversary, water. My interest was actually born many years ago when I was a child, growing up on the arid plains of South Africa. At that time there was a drought, the most terrible drought of the century. My grandfather, who was a farmer, watched helplessly as his crops shriveled and his animals started to starve. Eventually, he was forced to go out with his gun and shoot all of his stock. It was an event from which my grandfather never really recovered. And it impressed on me the stark and direct relationship between water and life. Years after that, I migrated to Canada and came to a place where water appeared to be endlessly abundant. People seemed to have absolutely no consciousness of water. It was just there for the taking. They took it completely for granted. And it was that contrast between the places where there was water and there was no water that was the impulse for setting off on this journey. Standing here in the middle of this desert, it seems impossible to believe that water actually covers more than 3/4 of our planet.
There's water everywhere. The problem is that the water that's available to humans is a small fraction of the water that's around. More than 97% of the world's water is salt water. It's water in the oceans. It's too salty to drink. It's too salty to use to grow crops. Of all of the planet's water that's in the world's rivers and the world's lakes, that water's less than 1% of the fresh water on the planet. Of the fresh water that is, in theory, accessible to us, the real challenge is it's badly distributed in space and time. We don't get water when we want it, and we don't get it where we want it. There are places like Canada and Norway where there's a huge amount of water available per person. and other parts of the world where there's insufficient water or insufficient water of the right quality to meet basic human needs for water. And that maldistribution of water is one of the greatest challenges.
Certainly, the natural distribution of fresh water is uneven, and so often it seems at odds with the wants and needs of the world's population. One of the most striking examples can be found here in China. Yichuan County in Shanxi Province is located on the vast Loess Plateau in China's northwest. This hilly region averages 1,000 meters above sea level, and fresh, clean water is a luxury. For generations, dealing with the scarcity of this fresh water has been a way of life.
Our village is called Yang's Village, right up there. 7 generations of our family have lived here. 7 generations. I got married when I was 15. I'm 67 now. You figure it out. I started to carry water when I was 12. We carried buckets of water over the shoulder, by hand, by donkey. That's how we'd get it home. With a big family of 10, there was never enough water to go around. Everybody was using water all the time, one after another. We would pour just a tiny bit of water in the basin for the entire family of 10 to share. My family depended on my father and me to carry the water. My grandfather was too old, and he was an educated man, so he didn't do that kind of job. And my grandmother had bound feet, and so she couldn't walk.
I've never had a shower or a bath in my entire life. No water. I only ever wash my face and hands. I'm really jealous of the people in the city. They use fresh water to wash their feet every day. What a joy. They use water whatever way they want. We water our vegetables with just a little bit on the roots, pouring it slowly so we don't waste any. We hardly have enough water here. We're afraid to waste any.
Some government officers from Beijing came here and lived in our village. They told us, look, the river down in the valley is flowing, but you don't have any water here on the mountain. What a waste. Finally, they decided to pump the water up the mountain. But our county government didn't support the idea. They thought that you have to use too much fuel to pump the water up the mountain. It's not worth it to exchange gas for water. So the pumping didn't last very long. Besides, there's not that much water down there anyway. Our biggest hope is to have more water. Generation after generation, we've lacked water here. We really are afraid of it. Right now, whoever has a baby boy will support him to go to school so he can serve the country and move to a better place. My biggest hope is when my grandchildren grow up, they don't have to carry water like I do now. They can build a washroom so when they need a shower, they just turn on the tap. That would be so convenient.
While it may be tempting to look upon this family as nothing more than quaint villagers making the best of their rural lives, the reality is that these are people living on the edge of survival. In fact, in 1990, more than 1 billion people didn't have enough water to meet their basic needs. And in 20 years, it's expected that more than 3.5 billion people will live in water-stressed countries. So, where is all the world's fresh water?
If this fountain represented all of the water on the planet, a tiny fraction, 2.5% of it, is fresh water. And most of that water is locked up in the ice caps of Antarctica and Greenland, or in deep groundwater, unavailable for humans. Of the world's runoff in the rivers of the world, 1/6 of it is found in the Amazon alone in Brazil. A huge amount of the world's annual runoff is in this one river. And yet, the world's population can't get to that water, and it's too expensive to move, or too environmentally damaging to move, the Amazon River's water to places where we really need it. Of all of the planet's water that's in the world's rivers and the world's lakes, that water's less than 1% of the fresh water on the planet. And if that were represented by this bottle, even a small fraction of this is available to humans. This amount of water perhaps represents the water in the rivers and lakes of the world. And yet, most of that water flows in the Amazon and the Congo, or flows into the Arctic, and isn't accessible to human beings. What we really care about is the small fraction of water that's really available to human beings. And that's represented by only a few milliliters of water, a tiny fraction of the amount of water that's available on the planet. And the fear is, of course, that we use that water inefficiently, we waste it, and we contaminate it.
The sad reality is that every 18 seconds, somewhere on this globe, a child dies from drinking polluted water. That's about 2 million children every year. We're becoming all too familiar with such images. People in the developing world barely surviving, with little or no access to safe, drinkable water. In Cambodia, homes are built high on stilts in an attempt to overcome the devastating floods that regularly ravage the country. But tall houses cannot help the people cope with their latest waterborne problems. Widespread microbial contamination of Cambodia's drinking supply has led to high rates of bacterial disease and a situation where 60% of Cambodians lack access to safe water, and 80% are without adequate sanitation. And now, thousands of that country's wells are showing signs of high levels of arsenic contamination, a potentially deadly problem with no obvious solution.
As you pump from further down in the ground, lower in the aquifer, the quality of the water deteriorates. And that's a simple function of the Earth's internal temperature being higher. And the higher temperature means that more things go into solution, they're dissolved. And some of those things are not very nice, like arsenic.
A good example of the challenges facing us in developing countries is the country of Bangladesh, where millions of wells were dug, millions of wells were drilled, and millions of people were provided with clean drinking water for the first time. It turned out, though, that many of those wells were contaminated with arsenic, a heavy metal that we didn't think to test for. Now there are tens of millions of people drinking water from wells that are contaminated with arsenic, contaminated to a level that we wouldn't be allowed to drink from in the developed countries today, in the industrialized nations. And we have to figure out how to solve that problem.
The Bangladesh disaster represents the largest mass poisoning in human history, and there is no immediate remedy. Worst of all, as Cambodia and Bangladesh illustrate, many people have little choice. When there is only contaminated water to drink, you drink contaminated water. For those of us living in comfort and prosperity, this calamity seems far, far away. It's something unthinkable, something that will never happen to us. But now, the unthinkable is happening in our own backyard. In May 2000, Canadians were shocked by terrible news. In the town of Walkerton, Ontario, 7 people died and more than 2,000 became severely ill simply because they drank the water. Their drinking water had become contaminated with a lethal strain of E. coli. It happened quickly and quietly, but the results were devastating. Who would have thought that a country like Canada, so big, so clean, with so few people, would ever have such a problem? But the frightening reality is that Canada is just catching up with the rest of the world. Pesticides and herbicides have killed the salmon in some of Canada's most glorious rivers. Agricultural runoff is contaminating the groundwater from coast to coast. In the past few years, hundreds of communities across the country have been placed under boil water advisories. Sometimes, the best advice is simply don't drink the water. In fact, many of us must suspect something is up with our local water. Last year alone, North Americans spent over $8 billion on bottled water.
The saga of bottled water is a very interesting saga because until recently, very few people drank bottled water. And now it's become ubiquitous. From movie houses to gyms to classrooms, everyone's got a small bottle of water on the desk or whatever. And the opportunity for businesses to make immense profits in bottled water is very tempting. Because surprisingly, bottled water now sells for more than milk, gasoline, oil, or products made with water like Coca-Cola.
Of course, for much of the world's population, bottled water is a luxury they simply cannot afford. This village in northern Namibia is typical of many in the region. Its only water resource is the local river, a single river that's required to meet all the people's water needs, and those of their animals. People here know nothing of clean, sanitized water. In Africa, fetching water is a woman's job. Jinga is an 18-year-old mother. Every day, her first chore starts with a long walk to the river. And for millions of African women just like Jinga, bringing home the water can take up to a third of a day. And sadly, the 20 liters of water she manages to carry home is not safe. Not safe at all.
Water scarcity is a problem in many places around the world. But connected with that problem is the problem that much of the water resources that are available are contaminated, either through human wastes or through industrial wastes or through agricultural runoff. If we cannot keep our water clean, then we reduce the amount of water that's really available to us to use.
If our planet's water suddenly vanished or became undrinkable, unusable, life on Earth would cease to exist. All life.
Water is the most precious commodity, the most precious resource on our planet. We use it for everything. We use it for industrial and agricultural and residential purposes. We use it to produce the things we care about.
For all its profound and wide-ranging importance, water is really just a simple compound of two gases, hydrogen and oxygen. But the presence of those gases, working in combination with primal geologic activity over millions of years, has resulted in a planet awash in water to an average depth of 6 kilometers. It was that way when the Earth cooled, and it has stayed that way ever since. The fascinating and quite startling reality is that the glass of water we drink today is the exact same water consumed by a thirsty dinosaur 65 million years ago. All of the water that has ever existed exists right now. Every molecule of water is forever trapped in the hydrological cycle.
The hydrologic cycle is just how water moves, and it's entirely a function of energy. The energy can come from the sun, evaporating water off the surface of the ocean, where then wind currents take the water over land. Then the water falls out in the form of rain or snow by gravity. Then a couple of things happen. For some of the water, it flows over the surface of the earth, down into rivers. But for other parts of that water supply, it goes into the ground. And here's where it's interesting. The water actually keeps moving, only now it's moving beneath the surface of the ground, laterally, where it joins rivers and streams to provide flow.
That groundwater farther downstream can replenish marshes or lakes or rivers. Some of the water resides in the ocean. Any molecule we have in the atmosphere certainly been in the ocean many times during many cycles. So it's a very complicated cycle on a global scale. It includes everything from oceans to ice caps to the water that's in the soil and in our lakes and rivers.
The frightening reality is that even though we appear to be a planet awash in water, not a single drop of new water has been produced since the world began. Water is not a renewable resource.
What we do know is that all the water that is. We cannot create more water.
We've seen that since the world began, water has assembled in oceans, lakes, rivers, streams, and marshes. But there is another, much more hidden place that holds this treasure. There are vast riches to be found deep underground. These are the world's aquifers, often regarded as great underground lakes and rivers that provide precious water far from any shore. It is where our wells go when we drill them. This brings us back to my homeland, the place where I grew up, South Africa. On my grandfather's farm, sometimes years would go by with no rain whatsoever. So, towards the end of his life, he brought in a drilling rig, sank a borehole 300 meters into the rock and shale, and found an aquifer. Although I was just a child, I still remember the cold, clear drops of water from the center of the world mingling in the dusty earth of the farm with the old man's tears. To my grandfather, it was a miracle, a purely good thing, life extracted from rock. What my grandfather was doing is called water mining, the unsustainable withdrawal of water from an aquifer that is no longer being refilled.
Groundwater was once thought to be inexhaustible. Vast, giant lakes, like the Great Lakes underground. We now know that really what groundwater is water that came down in the form of rain. The rain percolated or infiltrated the ground, and by the force of gravity kept going down. Eventually, there was no place for the water to go, and the underground cavities began to fill up. Groundwater actually supplies surface water to rivers. Think of it this way. If it hasn't rained in a while, where does water in a river come from? And the answer is it comes from the ground. Water is moving subsurface laterally where it eventually hits the river. That's where the river water comes from.
My grandfather did all right in this sparsely populated part of the world. But if there'd been more people doing what he did, the aquifer would have begun to shrink, and eventually it would have run dry.
There are many other parts of the world where unsustainable overpumping of groundwater is going on, and the North China Plain is a great example, as is part of the Central Valley of California. What we see in northern China is agricultural production that is reliant on unsustainable overpumping of groundwater. That cannot continue.
This is an ancient monument to human enterprise, visible even from space. This section of the Great Wall of China, north of Shanxi province, is ruined and almost buried beneath the relentless drifting of soil and sand. This ancient monument to human determination seems finally to have met its match. The reason the Great Wall is getting buried is water, or more accurately, the unnatural lack of water.
This portion of the Great Wall was built about 500 years ago in the Ming Dynasty. According to historical documents, Yulin, where we are now, was once rich in water and soil. Recently, the groundwater level has dropped dramatically. In the 1960s, the groundwater level was so high that you would be able to see it on the surface of the ground. This was called the Desert Sea. There were so many fish that I was once able to go fishing here, but they've all disappeared. On the north side of the Great Wall, the underground water level was 1 or 2 meters from the surface. But since the 1990s, it has dropped 3 or 4 meters deep.
Eventually, the groundwater aquifers are pumped lower and lower. That water is going to have to be found somewhere else, or that agricultural production is going to have to move.
It's a contrary sight. Wheat fields in the middle of the Sahara Desert. This lush grain is made possible only by groundwater that's piped in from hundreds of kilometers away. Libya is situated in North Africa. The Sahara Desert occupies almost all of its land. It is one of the most arid countries in the world. But beneath the Sahara Desert, there are vast aquifers which hold billions of liters of water. To get that water to where they needed it, the Libyan government embarked on the largest water mining project in the world. Today, the pipeline already carries more than 6 million cubic meters of water per day to Libya's 4 million people. That represents an incredible abundance of 1,000 liters per person per day, more than 5 times the North American average. Yet at this rate, Libya's aquifers are expected to run dry in less than 50 years. And then what? Unfortunately, Libya is not alone in draining aquifers at an alarming rate.
We've known for some time that some of the biggest aquifers in North America, like the Ogallala, which underlies 8 western states, has been being depleted at a very high rate, with the levels decreasing several meters a year.
Groundwater in the United States has become a very important supply. We now pump 27 trillion gallons of groundwater a year.
The first wells were tapped here in the desert of Arizona over 100 years ago. Back then, farmers had no idea what their practices would lead to.
In the early 1900s, when a lot of the turbine-type groundwater wells were put in, a lot of the wells were drilled in the area, the groundwater level was about 180 to 190 feet below land surface. And last time we took water level measurements, probably about last year or so ago, and the water level is about 250 feet now. So we've lost probably about 60 to 70 feet elevation on the static water level.
Today, groundwater can't sustain Arizona's farmers. They now use Colorado River water brought in over the mountains from hundreds of kilometers away.
Throughout the western United States, there's always been a criticism of agriculture because of the volumes of water that we use.
In fact, nearly 80% of the water we use goes towards agriculture. But driving all of that agriculture is an ever-increasing global population with increasing demands for food, clothes, and shelter. It is a dangerous situation. When it comes down to water or people, people tend to lose for one particular reason.
Some people think that in terms of population, that our water resources and our food supplies can sustain. We've passed it.
Overpopulation may well represent the greatest challenge we face in our efforts to avoid a water apocalypse. Yet the problem is not a simple matter of numbers. China and Canada each possess just over 5.5% of the world's fresh water supply. The two countries have almost identical water resources. But China's population, hovering somewhere around 1.3 billion people, is nearly 40 times greater than Canada's. Every 3 years, the number of babies born in China equals the entire population of Canada. And that's with the single child per couple policy in effect. In total, Asia is home to 3 billion people, half the human population of Earth, and its available water resource is only a small fraction of that found in North and Central America. The sheer volume of humanity in much of Asia is astounding. And every single one of these billions of people needs fresh, clean, safe water to live. But overpopulation is not unique to Asia or the Third World. Without mankind's intervention, Southern California can support perhaps 2 million people with its naturally available water resources.
Southern California now has over 15 million people in the 7 contiguous counties of Southern California. 15 million people. There's no way the natural carrying capacity of this area could sustain that many people. The success of the irrigation infrastructure, though, has made it possible to get bigger and bigger and bigger in terms of population, which requires more and more water.
Here in Tucson, the population of the valley is over 900,000 now. A tremendous increase, and it shows no signs of letting up. And the last time I counted, there were 145 subdivisions under construction in Tucson. Not homes, entire subdivisions.
50 years ago, the population of Las Vegas was 50,000. Today, this desert city is home to more than 1.5 million people. There are now more than 50 golf courses, where once there were only 5.
It worries me a lot because I've been here my whole life when this was a small town, and now everybody from back east is moving out here for the weather. At the rate that this valley's growing, I mean, we're growing between 4,000 to 6,000 people a month are moving to Las Vegas. Long term, if it keeps growing the way it is now, I foresee some serious problems because of the water. You can only draw so much water out of the tank before you say, oh, enough's enough, you gotta stop the growth. It'll definitely be a different valley for my grandkids than it is now, as it was for me, for my parents when they moved here back in the early 50s. I don't think I want to be here when it gets to that point. Just as a native, I'm wanting to get out of here because it's just too many people here.
The real issue for water use is population growth, and the real issue for any environmental issue is population growth. That drives everything else.
We're entering a future in which water's increasingly scarce, where competition for water resources is beginning to grow, and where the risk of violence over water is growing.
But quite frankly, I think the next major wars, political and otherwise, are going to be over water and not so much over oil.
This is the beautiful Okavango River, the 3rd largest river in southern Africa. The river begins in the hills of Angola and flows 1,400 kilometers through Namibia, where we are now, and then into Botswana. This village is a place dependent on the immediate availability of water and all good things associated with it. The Okavango is a life-sustaining artery. It nourishes and provides food. Clothing is washed in it. Children play in it. It is the highway for getting from one place to another. A multitude of life forms flourish within it. It even provides water lily roots and reeds used to build houses. In this part of the world, the river is life itself. Unfortunately, water levels in the Okavango have been dropping steadily, a dangerous situation at the root of escalating disputes between Namibia and Botswana. Disputes that bode ill for this small village, and by extension, this continent and even the rest of the world. This is because there was a growing and frightening willingness to fight over water. Of course, there are reasons. Botswana has suffered a decade of drought. The water levels of its dams and rivers are critically low. Next door, Namibia's population is growing rapidly, but its reservoirs are only 9% full. So it plans to channel 20 million cubic meters of water per year out of the Okavango system. But if Namibia carries out its plan, Botswana has threatened to blow up the pipeline. Namibia sees this as terrorism. Politicians on both sides feel they have little choice but to protect the water they need for their people. So the threat of a water war hangs heavily over both countries.
Many of the most important rivers in the world are international in the sense that they cross borders.
So there's a long history of conflicts and tensions and disputes over shared international rivers.
I think the conflict over water is going to become more acute, not less acute.
Water is fundamental to everything that we do. For that reason alone, water can be a political weapon. It can be a tool during warfare. It can be a target during war.
If anything foreshadows a water apocalypse, it has to be the specter of war. Yet who can deny that water is worth fighting for? Of course, there is always the possibility of people coming to their senses before it is too late. The world has certainly changed a lot since my grandfather's day. I don't think he would even recognize it. We have somehow managed to link our survival as a species with our aptitude for applying technological solutions to practically everything. We have now dammed or diverted almost every major river on the planet. We like to change things. But water does not really take kindly to change, no matter how hard we try. And still, the battle continues.